So the second patch of set 14 has hit the live servers, and I know the first couple of days was a bit sour tasting in everybody's mouths. Just, oh my god, it's just reroll meta, vayne, every game, Holobows, every 4-way contested, what do I do? I get it. I hear you. And quite honestly, I think that if your view of the patch is still this narrow focus, it's a pretty shitty patch. But I will actually argue that this current patch is actually pretty good. And I say that because I think as the patch has been given a couple days to sort of really settle in, there have been a ton of pretty interesting, viable options that do exist. They just might be a bit harder to pilot and a bit more difficult to identify the spots for them. But once you have identified them, I think you can find a lot of success. And in today's video, we're going to go over all of those different boards and variations, the conditions for each said positions, on when and how you can actually play these lines, and how you can find success. And I do want to share this with you guys as well real quick. If you know me, last time I was actually really in the dumps and really down on myself because I was having a terrible slump. And I was like hard stuck D3 for some reason. It was really bad and I was really frustrated. But I took a bit of a break, hit the gym a couple times, played less games, and quite honestly, I'm feeling so much better. I feel like I'm back. We're currently sitting 231 LP, so we're in GM right now, and feeling really good. We're back in the top 200 North America, and we're planning on, the plan is just to keep climbing and hit back up the challenger in no time. So I feel so much better. I feel much more confident giving my analysis, but I wanted to get this off my chest because I know I was so in the dumps, and I wasn't even streaming or doing anything because I was away, and I felt really bad. But we're back and feeling confident to talk to you guys about the current patch. Now, let's talk about it. So first off, let's talk about the one-cost rerolls. And we're starting off with a spicy one, which is Kindred and Nidalee reroll. Now, I think people might have already clicked off because they heard me say this is a good patch, and then I started off the video with Kindred Nidalee reroll. But, hear me out. I think this line is underrated, and I think it's misunderstood. And I also think it's very, very niche. I think this is a line you play once every like 20 to 50 games. Like, that is how niche I'm talking. Because I think when it comes to this line and re-rolling it, there's a couple of things that you need to keep in mind. First off, it is not a reroll on 6 board, it's a reroll on 5 board. There's a 2-cost reroll variation of it that is also being misplayed, but we'll talk about that when we cover the 2-cost section. Right now, let's focus on the 1-cost. In the 1-cost variation, you are actually rerolling Kindred and Nidalee. Now, Nidalee is not tanky at all. She is a glass cannon. Make sure that you get that through your head. When it comes to playing this line, I think people are not prioritizing Nidalee items enough. They're also prioritizing econ augments too heavily. And they're also disrespecting Kindred 3. I actually think this Kindred 3 unit is not bad at all. And actually, I actually think it's pretty solid. It's rarely gonna win you out the lobby, but it's a lot stronger than I think people give it credit for. And I think people are too tunnel vision on Jhin, especially in North America. I can't really speak on other regions, but at least in NA, I feel like the general sentiment when it comes to reroll Nitro is you have to reroll Jhin and that's it. No. And actually, I would argue Jhin 3 is a piece of shit. I actually think this unit's terrible. It's horrid. I think Jhin 2, fantastic unit. Really great item holder. Feels very great. Kills a lot of units. Good shit. But Jhin 3 is not enough to carry, especially not solo carry, where the current way that people have been itemizing this comp is they put 3 items on Jhin, 3 items on Shyvana, and just kind of magically expect the comp to work. It does not. You don't have a way to actually pump enough damage into the board that it actually makes sense. So this is why the Kindred Nidalee variation exists. Now, again, I want to emphasize something here. You might notice on the right hand side with the augments that you see investment strategy and spirit link. This comp, if you take Starry Night for it, you are trolling. Let me say that again. If you take Starry Night for this comp, you are trolling. If you take an econ augment like Prismatic Ticket and you decide to play Nitro reroll, unless you have the giga spot of all times, you are trolling. This comp really needs combat, and not only just combat, triple combat. You need a lot of power in this board if you want to see it succeed. And if you have to use an augment slot that requires, that could have been like a gold augment, like a gold combat, or it could have been like cybernetic bulk, for example, right? If you're using what could have been so much power into your board just to try to hit the board, you're gonna have a bad time. So make sure that if you're gonna play this line, you are identifying that like you have a way to make sure that you can basically guarantee that you'll find your units in like a reasonable pace and still be able to take combat augments in order to win out your spot. Again, triple combat is necessary. Another thing to note as well is that this comp, we'll talk about the positioning a bit more later in the 2-cost variation because it's way more important there. but just make sure that in this line, positioning wise, that your nidalee is not the first thing to take aggro. Again, it's a glass cannon. You do not want your nidalee to take first aggro, because if it does, it's just gonna die immediately. This is like basically like it's kind of like an AP. Think of it almost like an AP caster, but it goes in the front. Obviously, it's a little tankier than that, but it's a glass cannon. It will die pretty quickly, so you got to make sure that before it dies quickly, it gets the job done. So this is a very high tempo combat augment, pump power into your board type of line. So, and if you're wondering if it can win out lobbies, by the way, it actually can. Kaito actually played this in the most recent Tactician Trials over in APAC, and he actually went first in the lobby playing this Kindred Nidalee variation. The only difference is that he eventually moved the Nidalee items onto a Shyvana 3 and called it there. Now, there's, again, there's a ton of different ways to approach this line, but the conditions are very narrow. So again, I really don't expect you to play this line very often, but just know that it does exist and can succeed as long as you have the right mindset and approach when it comes to this line. But enough about that. We'll be talking about it a bit more in the 2-cost reroll section, but for now, let's end it there. Next comp to talk about is shaco reroll. This one will be a lot quicker to talk about. Shaco reroll, I think people have already been aware of this line. It's just vertical slayer. You reroll on 5 for that shaco 3. You could go for that mundo 3. It's not super necessary, but it does help thin out the pool. So if you really wanted to, you could. I think it's a bit of a waste of money, to be completely honest with you, though. I think at the end of the day, once you find that shaco, you hit within tempo, you just push levels and eventually try to get to that Z2, and that's going to be your main secondary carry. Positioning wise, assuming that you have the GA on the shaco here, this is going to be sort of the main way that you want to position, just being on the same side as the opponent's carry, Z being one off of the center on the same side as the opponent's carry, and shaco being in the corner, assuming you have GA. Z, ideally, will just jump into the back line and hit the opponent's carry here, and then shaco will just jump in and clean up the carry. That's the general idea behind the line. There are a couple artifacts that are making this line significantly more noteworthy. I think Luden's Ekko is insanely good on shaco. Prowler's Claw and Mittens also exist and are also very good items that you can utilize in order to prioritize, or not prioritize, but rather lean more towards shaco. But you don't have to, but it exists. It definitely makes the line significantly more playable as well. I will say it's a bit hard to hit Slayer units, especially if there's at least one other Vayne reroll player in your lobby, which there almost always is. So just keep that in mind when playing this line. You should have a really good spot for it, and I mean like shaco 2-on-2-1 at least with like a slam, like IE or Hodge. Like that's sort of the beginning / opener you're kind of looking for when it comes to this line. Again, good line. It's not A tier by any means. I think it's like B tier probably, maybe like mid B tier, low B tier. If you have an artifact though, it shoots up a lot higher though, so that definitely exists. Again, this is sort of kind of similar, and you'll notice this with a lot of the reroll lines, but ideally you take combat whenever you can. Like you really don't want to be taking like a reroll augment here just to play the shaco. It doesn't really make a lot of sense, especially because you'd only be rerolling just shaco and nothing else. So that is just a little bit of that for shaco. Again, not too much to cover, and I think we've done it justice. Moving on to the 2-cost rerolls, and again, we're back to Nitro. Holy fucking shit. We've talked about 2 comps, and they're the same ones. The 2-cost variation of this Nitro board does need to get covered. Again, this is the most misunderstood line in the entire scene in North America, and again, I can't speak for other regions, but at the very least in NA, it's heavily misunderstood. The 2-cost variation version is not Jhin. I don't know why people refuse to play around this naafiri unit. It's naafiri and nidalee. These are the 2 units you want to be playing around in order to top 4 with this board, and sometimes even win out, because this board can do a lot of work, and it's actually very strong, but it does run into a couple of problems. Number 1, the current meta right now is a lot of Vayne, a lot of TF, a lot of Zeri, single focus target. And that is really tough for a lot of melee units, and that's actually why this comp is a little lower in where it should be, because power level wise it's actually very strong. It's just that the current meta is not well suited for it. It's still playable, but if the naafiri literally gets focused down early in the fight, it can spell disaster. So that is sort of one of the big reasons why it's not sort of breaking the meta in my opinion, even though I think if Zeri gets nerfed and Vayne gets nerfed a little bit, this line's going to get significantly better. But that is not the only thing about this line that makes it so misunderstood. Not just the units that you got to prioritize, not just the itemizations, not just the current meta and why it's not a good fit for naafiri, but positioning. This is the hardest and most sweaty fucking line in the whole set. It is hard to top 4 with this board. Very hard. And the reason I say that is because when you position this line, you have to position every single round. Should you position every single round? Yes, you should. But this one, it's more like you got to be staring at the opponent's board and figure out the best side to be on every single time. You need to make sure that you're positioning to make sure that your naafiri and then your naafiri and nidalee are not getting like focused down immediately at the beginning of fights. Or like, for example, if your opponent is playing something like a Ross and the Ross is on the corner here, you're not stuck on the Ross at the very beginning because you're just going to keep getting CC'd. It's just going to be a bad time. Making sure that if you once you get to the Sejuani, there should be a Jax in the early game, Sejuani later, but make sure your Sejuani is actually casting and hitting the correct side to make sure that it is actually stunning your opponent's carries, right? Making sure that if you're gonna be playing around the Annie later down the line, yes, that is correct, not Jhin, you are positioning her behind the Naafiri and the Nidalee, or just making sure she's behind the Shyvana, just to make sure that after she casts and gets Tibbers on the board, then Tibbers is the one that's getting focused down, and not the Nidalee or the Shyvana or whoever after your opponent's original carry is targeting dies. Like, there's so much. There is so fucking much. And you can tell just like me rambling about this. There's so much shit you have to position for in this line. It is a headache. It is genuinely a headache. And again, you can top 4 and win out lobbies with this line. I've done it before. And I will say, my bot 4 has been playing this line. I've bot forward, top forward, 1, bot forward, 1, etc. Right? My experience with this line is that it's good. It is a good line, but holy shit, every time I bot forward, I am mad at myself. Because I know that it was top 4-able had I positioned better for like 1 or 2 more fights. Like, this 5th should have been a top 4. This 6th should have been a top 4. This 7th, I suck. But, like, you get the idea. There is so much thinking and sweating that comes with this line that you really need to make sure that you're doing your due diligence when it comes to positioning properly. And you will kick yourself in the face every single time you play this line. I'm telling you on God. If you wanted to completely avoid this line, you totally could. I would not blame you, but I'm just putting it out there that it's a very strong line. You just gotta know what you're doing. And that's the biggest portion about this. Another thing as well, this line is super narrow. This, like, as in, like, again, just like with all the other rerolls so far, you want combat, and like, you don't have to take like econ augments in order to hit it, but if you are, you better hitting a fuck ton of units, and you better be hitting fast, because if you're not, you should have just taken combat. One last thing to note is that the exotech really matters. Your 3 exotech is ideally Hyperfangs, because Hyperfangs, the naafiri is actually super strong, but it's not always going to be the case. It has to be your first exotech. It can't be any of the other ones later down the line, because normally you almost never really play anything past 3. Like 5 is very rare, because you just rather have the AMP in the back. So it's not ideal, but it's definitely available. So just make sure that if Hyperfangs is around, you could think about naafiri, but don't tunnel vision onto it, because again, very narrow, very difficult, and in the current meta with a lot of single target focus fire, not the most ideal to be playing. It's just not a good matchup in a lot of times. So still great into like AP strats, into like your classic like Xayah and like whatever boards, but currently it's a little tough. And even Xayah, actually, now that I'm thinking about it, Xayah and Leona, well, as long as you're on the opposite side, you're okay, but if you're on the same side as Leona and Xayah, you're kind of cooked, because then Leona will focus down the Fury and then keep stunning the shit out of her, and then Xayah's just gonna focus fire the shit out of your Fury. So again, a lot to position and a lot to cover. Again, difficult line. If I find it the time to have a VOD ready where I'm playing this line with Raptor, because he's the one that really coaches me through this line, if I end up playing it, I'll definitely post it onto YouTube, because I want to show you guys like when the line can work. But there's a lot. You'll hear him, like in our calls together, you'll hear him go every single time. Position, make sure to position, make sure to position. Are you gonna position? Make sure to position. Like every time, like 5 seconds before the fight's about to start. Like, it's ridiculous how much you have to pay attention. But I think I've rambled enough about this line. Let's move on to the next one. Next line is TF Reroll. Nothing has changed about this line. I will say that our understanding of good and bad artifacts has changed a little bit since the last time we've spoken about it. I still think artifacts are very good on this line. Wit's End was thought to be very good on TF, and then if you look at the stats, that's actually pretty shit. So that's taken off the board. I still think that artifacts are very good in this line. Innervating Locket's amazing. Anima Visage is amazing. Zanya's is very good. Gamblers, actually TF is the best unit to hold Gambler's Blade, as we've come to find out. So that's a very good thing to be putting onto the TF as well. So there are different ways to play around this line. And again, ideally, you kind of want to cap out the Draven. This doesn't happen. It happens even less now with the Cypher stuff, since last time we spoke about this line. This was just going to be our ideal secondary carry. Always 5 Syndicate. Very simple, very straightforward. Ideally, you want to cap out with 7 Syndicates somehow. It's very difficult to find the spats. You never really want to use a spat for your +1 for your augment. But if you stumble into 2 spats somehow, then sure, why not? Darius is your main tank. Double Gargoyles, I still think, is the best way to itemize this unit. Ginsu's Gunblade TF is good. If you don't have an artifact, just do double Ginsu's Gunblade. This line goes like 3rd or 4th, or if you're Frodan, 5th all the time. So like, that's sort of what's going on right now. I know Frodan had mentioned that like every time he touches his line, he tends to always go fit somehow. So no flame to him. I'm just reiterating what I've heard on his costume. But regardless, very solid line still, and you've seen it a ton in trials. It's a very like, I'm playing for 3rd or 4th or 5th, and I'm gonna be happy with any of those placements sort of line. Rarely wins out. Very rarely wins out. Maybe with an artifact it can, but very rarely wins out. Moving on, next one, Veigar reroll. I think this Veigar line is super overhyped. It's not that good except for new high score. I think if you have new high score, the line is very good. And then if you have Cower Weaklings, the line is good. And then if you don't have either of those, the line's like kind of shit. I really think this is an augment dependent line, and I think if you don't have it, you're going to struggle significantly more without it. Veigar BIS, Blue, Gunblade, and Nashers, but to be completely honest with you, JG has been very popular on the rise ever since they bug fixed the way that JG interacts. And actually, rumor is that the JG interaction got bug fixed, but now it actually is bugged again, but in a good way for Veigar, so he's doing even more damage than expected. So I don't know what the fuck's going on anymore. But regardless, Blue Nash's Gunblade, Blue Nash's JG, they're both good enough. You don't have to greed for Turbo Bis. Both of them are very close in Delta, so it's like you really don't have to worry too much about it. It's pretty chill. Poppy 3 is going to be your main tank if you're playing around, like, if you know you're going to get to like 4 Cyber Boss, it's going to be Poppy. Otherwise, most of the time, it's going to be Shyvana as your main tank. Again, these units really like items like Crown Guard, items like Vow, items like Adaptive, right? Stuff like this is really nice. 6 techie, 4 Cyber Boss. It's the exact same as it's been before, but again, I really think it's augment dependent, and I think too many players are trying to play this line when they don't have a good spot or they don't have the augments. I don't think that really makes a lot of sense. You could maybe try it without the augments, but like, the reason why new high score is so good is because it gives you both a Ziggs and a Kabuko and money and a shitter dupe. This augment is disgusting. So like, quite honestly speaking, that's why new high score is so good. Cower Weaklings, it's good because it buffs the line, but I don't think it's good enough that it makes the line like A tier. I think like Cower Weaklings make this a B tier line. New high score makes this like a high A, low S line, and then without either, it's like a C tier line, I think. I really don't think it's that good. So that's kind of where I stand on it. Very simple, very straightforward. Not much to talk about, really. You obviously just don't have to do Cyber Bosses, so when you're re-rolling on 7, you wouldn't have this either. It's like some variation that looks a little bit like this. Obviously, you're going to put something else in instead. It's probably going to be like 3 Street Demon to some degree. But you get the idea. Very straightforward, very simple line. Not too much to really have to cover here, I think. But that's going to do it for that one. Next one I want to talk about is LeBlanc Reroll. Now, let me take a sip of water real quick because I've been yapping a bit. God, I fucking love water. Holy shit, water is so tasty. Man. You know, there's this one time I saw Asmon Gold. He was like, I don't drink water, I only drink soda. And he tried to drink water, and then he was like gagging. I don't know why I started talking about that. Anyways, LeBlanc Reroll. I think this line is only playable if you have a Mana Zane. I think that there are going to be times where you could do like a Shojin, Nashers, Archangels. That's sort of what it looks like without the Mana Zane. But generally speaking, when it comes to this line, Mana Zane is going to be sort of like the real thing that's going to kick your LeBlanc into high gear, just to make sure that the LeBlanc is actually going to be pumping and doing work. Ekko 3 is a good enough tank. It's not a very contested 2-cost unit, so it's pretty easy to hit, especially with so much 2-cost reroll in the current meta. So things like your Crown Guard, things like your Adaptive, things like your Vow. You're going to see me saying this a lot. Like these are like going to be like the Turbo Bis for Ekko, generally speaking. You can also do things like Warmogs is fine, Generic Tank is fine. Again, they're totally okay. But just keep in mind, Nico 2 is better than an Ekko 3. So as soon as you hit Nico 2, you want to transfer items over, and Ekko 2 is just going to like live on your board, and you're just going to call it there. You just play vertical strategies. It's very straightforward. It's a line that is good, but it's not a line that is popular because I think at the end of the day, it's very unlikely for a lot of players to hold onto LeBlancs in the early game. It's really like you got fed like a LeBlanc 2 and you have like good like an Archangel slam, and like you can go like, okay, no, maybe I can consider this, or like a Shojin slam, you're like, okay, maybe I can consider this. It's very rare niche case scenarios you ever play this line. I don't think I even have a rep on it, but I'm putting this in here because I think I've heard other players talk about it, and I wanted to include it because I didn't want to neglect it. I've heard players top 4 with it. I've seen YBY1 actually play a LeBlanc 3 Yuumi 3 variation that came out of like a Cypher cash out. I would assume his Cypher cash out was like the shitter dupes, but he played some crazy variation that included like this with like 3-star Alawi as like his main tank. and like some sort of like anima like sort of setup. Like I don't remember the board. I was actually, funny enough, I was gonna VOD review it, but then the VOD got taken down. I don't know why. Maybe he's trying to hide tech or something. But yeah, I was really sad to see that it got taken down. I was like, holy shit, I really wanted to record it and see what was going on. But the game happened live on a stream, and I watched like a tidbit of it, and then I saw his endgame board, and I went, how the fuck did he get here? And I tried to look at the VOD, and it was like immediately taken down. It was like hidden tech for some reason. So I was like, oh shit, like I can't find it. So really cool board, but usually it doesn't end up like this. It's usually just the it's usually just like the strategist instead, and then you're kind of just gonna call it there. But again, really cool board, really high potential, but really difficult to do well with, and you need a really good spot for it. So C tier, maybe low B tier, mid B tier, but very strict conditions. Again, very niche scenarios, but it does exist. Finally, gonna talk about a little bit here. I don't know why this is in the 2-cost rerolls, but I guess now let's talk about 3-cost rerolls. This is Draven reroll. Again, Draven has not changed too much. This is more just like hostile takeover, but you don't need hostile takeover. You just play into Cypher, and then you cash out and you reroll Draven plus Galio. The line is a little harder nowadays to play around, just because I do think that the Zeri unit is super giga contested, and that just makes it a lot harder to find everything. But it's tough because Draven 3 is like not enough to solo carry. Like he autos too slow, so you need like the Z2 to be there to really make sure that you are gonna like win out. I think Z2 is way more consistent than having another Zeri 2. But it's hard to say. Like at the end of the day, like it's whatever you really hit and whatever you find. BISZ obviously is gonna be the IE double Hodge here, but GA is fine, Sterax is fine. GA is like not actually that fine, to be completely honest. Like Sterax is definitely better. Deathblade is fine, whatever, but he kind of has like an auto cleanse, if you will. Basically, the idea being is that not an auto cleanse, excuse me, but he gets untargeted very quickly because he just dashes too far away, and then suddenly your opponent's carry starts hitting something else, right? That's sort of the way that it ends up playing out. You have the dummies in here because of hostile takeover. I believe it's like the 550 cash out. You could get like a double dummy in here. It's not always going to be the case, but most of the time you just drop out of the 3 ciphers here, and you play a variation that looks something along the lines of this, but more commonly we end up doing is just playing for Bastion. We just play something like this instead, and this is sort of the main line for Cypher. Again, you really want to make sure you get to that Z2 or the Zeri 2 and have a good way to play around it. I think most of the time I've seen players play like the level 8 variation instead, where they play around Zeri, but again, Zeri's so contested because of the Holobow like boner that everybody has right now. So I would say that generally speaking, if you're going to play the level 8 version, you're going to try to want to itemize for Zed instead, because that's going to be a lot easier to find. But again, it's not going to be perfect because Zed is super congested with all of the Slayer's players. So I don't know, it's tough. I think this line is hurt a little bit more because of the current meta, but I don't think it is bad or should be ignored from good spots. So I just want to throw that out there. Again, still a very solid line. You do reroll on 7 for the Galio and the Draven. That's the easiest way to stabilize, but again, you do need a dual carry somewhere, ideally being Zed or Zeri, one of the two. But yeah, very straightforward line. Next one on the 3-cost reroll side is, Vayne reroll. You might be going, what the fuck, Vayne reroll? That was a roll on 6 comp. Can be, but realistically speaking, what ends up happening is that most of the time, you do not natural a ton of copies of Vayne. You can, and if you natural a ton of copies of Vayne, you will end up playing around, just reroll on 6, hit your Vaynes, and then push level. But most of the time, what ends up happening is that you have a Vayne 2 on your 3-2 roll down, which is great, but maybe you didn't find a ton of other copies. Maybe you didn't find ton of other 2-costs, but like you've upgraded enough of your front line that you're like, you know what? Okay, that's good enough. I'm going to push to 7, because that makes my board a little bit stronger, and I get to, like, you know, stabilize a little longer, and I get to fit in a much nicer looking board. And what I mean by that is that your level 7 board is literally just this. This is your level 7 board. Very straightforward, where you have 4 Slayer, 4 Vanguard, and this is nice. You could play the Silas over the Rost here. I do like Rost a little bit more than Silas, just because, one, you gotta take out more 2-costs, so it's easier to thin out the pool for Vayne, but also, I think Rost 3 is a little slept on. I think it's actually pretty decent. I don't think it's bad, and I think Skarner 3 is actually pretty contested with TF players in the lobby, so Rost actually ends up being kind of clutch as like sort of like this potential tank that exists in case you miss on the Leona 2 or the Skarner 3. So I actually like holding Rost these days. I think it's very, very nice. The real power of this comp comes from not only just having Vayne 3, but by having Senna and Draven 3 as well. You really want to have all of them. Draven can be itemized in sort of like an AD bruiser. A-day. excuse me, AD Bruiser melee way, which is like BT, Sterax, Titans. I've seen like IE Hodge Prowler's Claw, which was like, I think it's like one of those, like, you know those fake Chinese League videos? You know what I'm talking about? Or like the fake Valorant Chinese videos? Like, you know what I'm talking about? Like they're staged, trying to show off something cool that happens. They're still entertaining and fun to watch, but it's just like they're staged. The IE Hodge Prowler's Claw J4 was a staged game, I believe. There's no way anybody with a brain is clumping their backline the way that the video did. But basically what ended up happening was, in case you don't know what I'm talking about, is that the opponent was playing like a Nemo board, and there's like 6 different units that were in the back here for some reason. They were all just clumped to the back like this. And then J4 ends up having, he gets 1 kill here, and then with IE Hodge Prowler's Claw, he ends up dashing into the backline and just dealing like 1 sweep, just completely clears the backline board. And it was just such a disturbing video to watch, but it was so funny. So again, what ends up happening, he clears 1 unit here, then he dashes here, and then he swipes. Everything in this corner is dead. Really cool, really fun to watch, but is it realistic in most of your games? Probably not. I think if your opponent has a brain, they would never clump their backline in such a way like this. Most of the time, your opponent would position something more like this or like this, which is way more common, which is why BT Sterax Titans is probably the best way to build this unit. This line doesn't really care too much about tank items, but you do need a tank. So I will say that. You don't want to like itemize Vayne first and Jarvan second. You really want to make sure you go Vayne first, whoever your tank is second, and then extra items can go on J4, onto Senna, onto Zed, whoever it may be. Depends on what you hit and what you find. Senna likes a lot of high AD, high damage like items, so things like Deathblade, things like IE, GS, Runehands, these are really great on her. She hates attack speed, hates mana gen, doesn't really need any of these things. It's just, you just want her that every time she autos, she's hitting like a fucking truck, and she just like 1 tap, suddenly boom, they're like chunked for like half their HP. Zed is going to be itemized the same way as he always has. Not going to talk too much there. Again, the positioning is very similar. Nothing much to really talk about there. You do need an Evan Shroud. That's probably the best way to go about it. You don't have a good Last Whisper holder in this entire line. Senna's auto attack speed is too slow. Zed's dashing around everywhere, and unless he's on the opponent carry, he's not going to shred him, and even then it's not that great. You're going to have a ton of beef in the front line, so Evan Shroud is going to be the way to go. J4, yes, he does have Sunder in his kit, but it's flat armor reduction that only occurs when he casts, so it's not very reliable. So you're going to want an Evan Shroud at some point inside of this line. Very simple line. Another thing to note as well is that pumping up too much value and anger issues are some really strong augments that you can find in this line that are going to really do you a solid. Pumping up is arguably not so much as like I am playing Vayne no matter what, but it's just a good generic combat augment. Too much value, there is a too much value variation of this board, which is this one right here, where you're playing the Alawi instead to keep the 3 anima, and you just play 2 Slayer instead on 6, and you get to bank all those extra rolls to eventually try to find everything. Really strong on board, and really strong augment for this line. I also have a tweet here from Kim as well, which I think was pretty interesting that I wanted to point out. I can't verify it for certain, but he does say that if you have the spot for 3-star Senna instead of Vayne, 6 Slayer is better than 4 Slayer and 4 Vanguard. So I think with the way that the current meta has sort of played out is that basically what he's trying to say is that instead of playing this variation, if you don't end up finding the Vaynes and you don't end up having any of the 2 stars in the front line, the 3 stars in the front line, then you could drop Skarner, you could drop Rost, and you could play 6 Slayer instead. I think that makes a lot of sense. I think it only really works though if you missed on your front line and then you'd have a Leona 2 to item hold everything. Maybe Jarvan could end up being the item carry instead. I think that's how he has it. Yeah, he has like Jarvan with like tank items here, but I don't know how I feel about 100%. I still think this version feels a lot better and a lot safer and more consistent, but I could see 6 Slayer arguably being better in certain niche case scenarios. So I just want to point that out there. I think that is great. But that's enough about Vayne. And again, Vayne, like strength-wise, is really strong. She's easily like the top S tier reroll line right now. So if you have a spot for it, you should try to call it in your chat as soon as possible and try to not get contested. But anyways, enough about Vayne. Let's go on to the next 3-cost reroll board. Now, excuse me, I'm gonna grab some more water here. Oh my god, dude, I love water so much. I feel like, like water is bliss, bro. Water is bliss. All right, Executioners. Now, Executioners, you might notice on the board here, this is the old variation of Executioners where we talked about it and yapped about it for quite a long time. If you watch the last patch analysis, you're gonna have to forget everything that was said in that video, because now there's a new variation of Executioners that exists. which is this one. It is vertical street demon, and you actually invest less into the executioner line, but you still cap out in a very similar fashion that looks something similar to this. So let's talk about it. So first off, the executioner line. It's not really fair to call it Rengar anymore. It's more Jinx and Rengar as her sidekick. It's like if you're watching Arcane, Rengar is Isha and Jinx is Jinx. That's sort of the way that this line is sort of played out. You want to prioritize the Jinx items first. That is going to be your main bread and butter. Obviously, an Executioner Crest is ideal on Jinx. She does so much fucking damage you can get it onto her. You just drop the Vex on level 7 and you just play 7 Street Demon. No Executioners. Rengar ends up becoming a bit of a pseudo tank in the line, and that's sort of how you end up playing the line now, which is why Rengar's BIS does not really matter. Excuse me. At the end of the day, you just want to make sure that he has things like Titans, things like Sterax, things like BT, things like Hodge. Some healing, some sort of beefiness, and he's going to put in some work, but he's not the main focus of the line. Jinx is just going to be pumping damage like a motherfucker, and then Rengar is just going to be there to clean up the scraps. That is sort of the way that the line works. Brand can be itemized as well for AP if you end up finding yourself in a weird situation where you end up with a ton of AP items. But realistically speaking, what ends up happening is that these brand items are only going to be on brand for so long, because the way you cap out this board is you actually drop brand Zyra and you end up playing 5 executioners. The reason why we don't play 5 executioners too early is because 1, it requires an Urgot. Very, very difficult and elusive unit to find. Especially if you're rerolling on 7. It's going to take a while to get there. But ideally speaking, 5 Executioner is super strong, because if you don't know, at 5, your Executioners actually also get some durability, which is super, super nice. I think another thing to note as well is that if you don't end up finding this Executioner crest, it is significantly harder to get to 5, because you end up needing to play the Varus on 9. It is very hard to get to this spot, and crazy enough, I will say this as well, is that most of the time you will never really end up finding yourself in a position like this. Most of the time you end up ending the game on level 8. If you're lucky, level 9, and you can play something like this. But you can also do something kind of interesting, which is God of the Net. And if you find an early Garen, you can actually mod the Jinx with Executioners, and then you can actually justify playing more Executioners. Again, though, I will say this, is that even though, yes, this is ideal, what ends up happening is that on 9, 95% of the time, I would argue, most of the time, you end up just playing around 3, if not 4 Executioner, and you have to kind of call it there because your board cannot fit anymore. Again, it does not have to be the Garen if for whatever reason you just can't find a fucking grave somewhere, or maybe you just miss on the Urgot, but Garen is nice to get that Executioner mod onto Jinx, and that actually pumps a lot of damage into your board. And again, you don't have to keep going up into the Executioner tree. You can just go with more Street Demons, more Legendaries, however it may be. But ideally, you end with 5 Executioner whenever you can. It's just difficult to get to that point. I think that basically does it for this line. There's really not much to talk about. Jinx's BIS is going to be Shojin GS LW. GS because of the current meta, because of so much reroll and a lot of HP on the boards, but an LW because she is going to be a really good LW holder. That's basically going to do it. Nico is going to be your main tank. Not too much else to talk about. And again, it's 7 Street Demon for a while until you try to cap out with 5 Executioners if you manage to make it there. But that is really it. I will say one last thing to know. Actually, I do want to mention this before we go. Cut Purse. I think this augment was an auto pick last patch. Nowadays, it's not auto pick because it's a little awkward, because it kind of makes you want to lean more into the Executioner side of things. And I think that if you end up taking Cut Purse, you actually end up playing 5 Street Demon instead of 7, and then your level 7 board looks something more along the lines of this. This is going to be sort of the main way you play around it. I think instead of Grey, it's just going to be the Varus instead. But I think Cut Purse is really good if you manage to find Trifecta. Trifecta with this board is super good because it supports both trying to lean a bit more into the Executioners, but now you also have 3 units that you can potentially 3-star and play around with a tertiary carry being the Varus as well, who can hold Shojin, Morello, and Archangel. So the Trifecta version of this board is definitely super, super strong, but it's really hard to get there. So if you take Cut Purse, you're probably playing the Trifecta version of this board if you manage to find the augment, but otherwise it can be a little dubious, because again, you don't really want to play into the Executioners, you want to play more into the Street Demon, and you're going to be playing into Street Demons for a long period of time before you're able to cap out with the Executioners at 5. That is sort of where we're at with this composition right now. very strong still, I will say though. I would put it in like middle of A tier, but it's not like an S tier comp, and I still think that it's a line that like you need to make sure that if you're gonna bleed in the early game, you stabilize mad hard. And I think Rengar 2 is one of those units that's like, it's good, but it's not gonna stabilize you during stage 4. So you really need to make sure that like if like you have HP to bleed during stage 4 if you're not like Rengar 3 or Jinx 3 by like 4-2, 4-3, which is super early. Most of the time for 3 cost reroll tempo wise, you're hitting like 5-1. So that's sort of where we're at right now with Rengar. But again, really cool line. And again, 5 execution is the way you cap out here. If you can get to that point, it's a 2.8 AVP. Very strong, very difficult to get to. Finally, I think I want to talk about Fiddlesticks and more like the death of Fiddlesticks. So sad. This line used to be so good, and nowadays, not very good. Which is sad. I think that this line, it can still work in very niche case scenarios, but I think it's really just like Sniper's Focus or Blighting Jewel only. If you have either of those, like let's say you're given an Artifact Anvil and you're given Sniper's Focus 2-1, and you have some bruisers, fine, angle it. But realistically speaking, I think 90% of the time, I think you just don't even really consider this line in your repertoire anymore. I would actually put this line like middle to low B tier. They did do some Cho'Gath changes, so I think that is something that is like kind of good, but okay, their intention was good, is what I'm trying to say, but the actual execution is horrible. Sorry. Cho'Gath is just not where he needs to be, and if anything, he's actually worse than where he was. So that's just not great. I think a line that I think a lot of people were made aware of was Cooking Pot into Bruisers early, and then leaning into Bruisers and eventually playing into it, because basically you could Cooking Pot a Bruiser thing and then lead it into some Giga Tank in the late game, and then you can play around that, or you can feed Cho'Gath so he has a lot of HP. And yes, it's still good, but I think Fiddle is just not enough to really solo carry and do well, especially without Sniper's Focus, where he's like stuck in the front line here. It gets a lot more dubious and a lot more difficult to play out the line. And again, with so much single focus target in the current meta right now, things get like whittled down pretty quickly before they can scale up, and that is a very, very big counterpoint against Fiddlesticks. So it's a bit of a not great line right now. Again, you should know it, but should you ankle it like most games? No, probably not. Again, low B tier, maybe even C tier. It's really not that good. I will say this though, one last thing to know, Cooking Pot. I didn't mention this earlier, but there is an interesting Cooking Pot Vanguard variation that's going on right now where you Giga Feed a Jarvan and you play it on Jarvan 3. Super cool stuff, but if you're playing Cooking Pot, I think that's sort of the main line now, which is super cool, but there's other things as well as like Executioners and yada yada yada. They all exist, so a lot of cool stuff. But anyways, enough about the reroll lines. It has been like 40 minutes. Let's talk about the verticals. Let's talk about the level 8s. Because there's a couple that you gotta know. Take some water. Get a sip of water. Sorry, I feel like I'm talking about a lot of water, but like it's good. It's necessary. Poland Spring, if you're watching this, like let me know. Or Brita. Damn. Or Hydro Flask. Not sponsored, by the way. I got you though. Let's talk about level 8. The big elephant in the room that I think that a lot of people have felt like has died this patch. I don't think that's the case. I think you just gotta know how to play into it. Level 8 is only playable if you tempo into it. If you do not tempo into your level 8 board, you will not do well. You need to preserve your HP in the early game. And if you do not, you should really consider your reroll options. I think right now, in the current meta, and it might change, but currently, because reroll is such a heavy focus right now, a lot of players are playing super weak early game boards. And I'm talking super weak stage 2. Sometimes you get by with like a 5 streak for like no good reason. You have some Seraphine 2 with some bullshit in the front, a Shift Slam, and a Dream. And that is all that there is to your potential streak. And sometimes it's enough. If you can manage to save your HP in the early game, then you will have a much better time when it comes to playing into these 4-cost variations. Because what ends up happening is that during stage 4, usually you start to bleed, which is not normally the case. If you play level 8, usually 4-2 is when you stabilize and you're chilling. But because reroll is so prevalent, now the tempo is sort of shifted. Where now 3-2, you're getting beat down because people have rolled on 3-2 and they found their upgraded units, and you're getting whittled by all these reroll players with slightly more stabilized boards because they invested a little bit. But then 4-2 hits and you're like, oh, I should be stable now. But surprise, surprise, now the reroll players have hit their units and you're getting beat down even more. Stage 3 and stage 4 are going to be the hardest stages throughout the game. And if you do not have the HP to preserve throughout stage 2, and ideally throughout some of stage 3, you're gonna have a bad time during that time. If you can survive stage 3 and stage 4 to get to your 2-star forecasting, to get to your board, that is when you will succeed and do really well with level 8 boards. That is sort of the tempo right now, and I think that people right now, for some reason, are just loose streaking into level 8 boards, and they're like 40 HP on 4-1, and then they expect to do well. That's not how this is gonna work, buddy. You're gonna have to tempo into the line and make sure that you can actually stabilize and give yourself time to stabilize to hit your units, and make sure that it's not like 5-1 and you're 15 HP and there's a Rengar player in your rotation and you're kind of shitting yourself like, oh god, what do I do? But enough about that. Let's talk about the actual line. The first line to talk about is 5 Street Demon. Still a very, very solid line. And I think that this line actually has some of the highest cap in the entire game right now. It can beat out reroll boards. It can beat out vayne boards and whatnot. But the only problem is that you have to get there. That is the hardest part. And we've already gone over how to get there. But let's talk a little bit about the actual units themselves. Ziggs 2 is going to be your main priority as your item carrier. Obviously, you will itemize whoever you find first. I like Ziggs a little bit more, and I'll say why. With the Cyber Boss bonus active, this Ziggs unit actually hits a shit ton of units and hits them like a truck. He actually hits really hard. Without the Cyber Boss bonus though, I do find him a little bit lackluster. Just because his ability doesn't spread out so wide, and then it feels like it's not hitting as much, and it does not feel very good. Brand as well is a strong hitter and hits like a truck as well. The only problem though is that his cast time is super long, and you'll notice that Brand does this big wind up, and it's cool theoretically until you realize that as he's winding up, he's getting whittled down by a Zeri and then he dies. That kind of fucking sucks. So I do think that Brand's cast time does make him feel a little worse. I'd be down for them to lower his damage slightly just to improve the cast time animation so it doesn't feel as clunky. But obviously if you hit a Brand 2 and you have a Ziggs 1, itemize the Brand 2. If you hit a Ziggs 2 instead of a Brand 1, then itemize the Ziggs 2. Very straightforward. 5 Street Demon is going to be your main core. You want to play around Nico, Ekko, Ziggs, Brand, Zyra. That is sort of like your, Nico, Ekko, Ziggs, Brand, Zyra, Mundo. That is sort of like your main core. Everything else around it can flex. As you notice, there is 3 Bruiser in here. That is because eventually if you find the Kobuko, I think you want to drop the Mundo and then potentially maybe drop something else instead, or play a different Street Demon. That's totally chill because you get the Bruiser Techie from Mordekaiser. Obviously, Techie is good because you get the Viego. It's chilling with the 4 Techie and Zyra. Yeah. There's a lot of ways to flex around it. There's a lot of units that can fit into this board as well. You have units like Zac that can fit in. You have units like Garen that can fit in because you can farm strat mods. You can get units like Annie fits. I think Yumi fits, right? There's a bunch of different ways that you can like flex units into the board, and this board is hard to pilot. You need reps. Like I'm not gonna sit here and pretend like I'm a master of this line either. You need reps on this line to make sure you succeed, and I definitely feel like I have enough reps that I feel good about the line, but I don't have enough that I feel confident about the line. I will say that. So I've had my share and success with it, but it's difficult to really win out. Or not difficult to win out, but it's difficult to pilot. And every time I have to pilot it, I am shitting myself a little bit. Samira is also a really great way to cap out your board with Samira 2. Items like IE, GS, you can move the guard breaker over, which is super easy. Samira 2 actually pumps a lot of damage into the board super late game, which I think is great. It just really helps clean up and actually whittle down units, and she works very well with Ziggs, where Ziggs will like bomb a certain area of the board, and then Samira just fucking goes in there and then just does her spinny shit and then cleans it all up. So really cool way that they interact with one another, and I think it works. It's just, it's hard to get to that point, you know what I'm saying? Like, again, like your cap ideally is like Viego 2, Kobuko 2, Samira 2, Zac 2, right? You drop the Mordekaiser or maybe the Mundo and even the Zyra, and then you put in some other shit as well. You probably end up with 3 sheet to me, just drop the Brand entirely, and then you can play stuff like, Mordekaiser goes back onto the board. You have stuff like AMP and strats, you end up playing something like this. Golden Ox would also fit into here, and like a board like this, there's already 10 units on the board. There's so much shit that can happen. So like this board, very good board, but very difficult to win out with, and it's very, very, very high cap. And in case it looks familiar to you, that's because it's basically strat amp, but it's just harder to get there compared to previously. But still, very solid board, and definitely I would argue this is the strongest comp in the entire meta if you can 2-star everything and get there. So good board, very hard to get there. But moving on to the next one is going to be Exotech. Exotech was a very recent discovery. I want to say that it was discovered maybe about 2 or 3 days ago. like I think on Friday was I think when people were starting to really start to respect the exotech. The line is very simple. It's Vex primary, Varus secondary, and then Varus just kind of item holds for your Aurora items, and then you eventually transfer these over to Aurora, and then Aurora is going to be the one that really carries out the board. You don't have to play 5 exo. You can drop down to 3 if you really need to. There's a bunch of different ways that you can tech out. You can tech out a Jin and more. You can play things like you can play Zac, you can play Viego, you can play things like Dynamo, Morgana, right? Things like this. Like this also really works out well. I think that's perfectly fine. You might be wondering why Viego's in here. You can switch out the Gragas for some sort of techie. Like you could do like Mordekaiser and then switch something else with something else, right? Like this could be Renekton instead, right? You got the idea. Ton of different ways to play this line. Very solid line. And I think this line is really great because once you have that Vex 2 online, the board feels pretty solid. And I think it's actually a really, really solid board to win out lobbies with. I would argue that this can be a last stand composition, which I think is super cool. I think Pokygom actually played last stand in the second day of TAC trials and ended up winning out with this board. So really high cap, really cool way to play the board around. You know, again, the cap is super high with like Zac 2, Viego 2, Aurora 2, Renekton 2. You can even have Garen in there, try to figure out some Dynamo shit, Dynamo mods. It makes a lot of sense. I think there's a lot of potential in this line. Vex itemization is going to be blue buff Gunblade Guardbreaker. The reason being is that her passive, she gains 15% Omnivan, but 150% of her overhealing from her ability is converted to bonus true damage to her primary target. So that is what really makes Vex so strong. And you know, Guardbreaker and blue buff are also really great as well. Those are going to be your main bread and butter. The only thing I will say though is that this Gunblade item kind of fucking sucks. So I think Frodan was the one that mentioned this on his co-stream, but Gunblade feels bad because if you itemize Gunblade too early, your damage items are blue buff Gunblade. Ugh. And it feels like you don't really do too much. I would say the Gunblade is very good on Vex, but I also would argue that Gunblade should be the last item you prioritize. It really should be like Guardbreaker and Blue Buff are like the two main ones that you're trying to angle first, and then you eventually find like that Rod or that Gunblade. You can even put Morello as like your early item holder, and then eventually find the Gunblade last. I think that's perfectly acceptable. I think, again, it's a line that you kind of want to tempo into. You don't want to be losing too much HP on your way to level 8. Vex 2 is going to be the most important, and a very big problem with this comp, actually, is because of the current Zeri lottery, Sejuani 2 and Mordekaiser 2 are your main bread and butter when it comes to the front line. So you really want at least Mordekaiser 2. That's going to be kind of like the main one that you want to realistically find on level 8. Mordekaiser 2, Sej 1, Vex 2, that's enough. Go 9. Stop right there. Halt. Sorry. Another thing to know as well is that the exotech items as well. I think this line gets really good if your third or fifth is chassis. I think chassis Mordekaiser is disgustingly strong. And when it comes to your Mordekaiser items, things like chassis plus Warmogs makes this guy a giga beast. I think he's super tanky. And I think it's super chill just to have this as like your main tank for like stage 4 and even early parts of stage 5. I do think as well Sejuani does not really care too much about her items. Vow, I can't believe I'm about to say this. Her BIS is actually Vow or Vow adaptive. Or sorry, it's Vow or Vow adaptive. It's one of the two. The reason being is I just want her to cast and she's just a cast bot. She's not actually a great holder of tank items. She doesn't do a great job at being an actual tank. She just CC bots, stuns, and like just hopefully she gets 2 or 3 casts off and you just kind of call it there. There's some also, by the way, really interesting anti-Sejuani positioning tech that happened earlier today on the Tactician Trials Day 2 co-stream in North America. But turns out if you have Val Viego, this actually hard counters Sejuani, because what ends up happening is that Viego will basically like on the same side as Sejuani will like cast once or twice, or auto once or twice rather, excuse me, and then just jump behind the Sejuani. Then the Sejuani turns around and then actually casts in a semicircle, and then if you have a carry back here in this corner, like let's say back here, it actually, Sejuani's ult does not actually touch the Ziggs in the backline. So this is a really cool interaction that was like sort of discovered very recently that I wanted to point out, but I thought it was super dope. But it's very niche. It's not gonna happen most of the time. Again, at the end of the day, you don't really want to put a blue wall for like a Vow on your Viego, but adaptive could work. I don't know if it'll cast fast enough, but that is an option that does exist. So Really cool tech as well for anti-Sejuani positioning, but nonetheless, this is going to be the board. Veigar also loves holding TG, by the way, so if you can get a TG Veigar going, super fucking dope. Really great. Obviously, your main AP items are going to be Aurora, who's going to be your secondary carry, and then Veigar to hold TG, or maybe move items. But that's really going to be the board. Very straightforward. And again, Vex Varus, again, performing very well in the stats here. I just wanted to point this out as well. Now, let's go over the vertical compositions, because this is probably what everyone has been waiting for, which the first one we're going to talk about is going to be Zeri. Excuse me, sorry. I noticed that if I talk for a long time, my nose gets a little bit running, so I do apologize. But Zeri, let's talk about it. So 7 exotech Zeri is sort of the main thing that's going on right now, and I know it's frustrating. Holobow is disgustingly strong. Obviously, Holo and Pulse, if you have them together, is super, super strong. If you have Holobow, you're already like, oh, I should think about Zeri. And then if you don't have the Pulse, then you just go Ginsu's IE Holobow, and this is going to be your main build for Zeri. Really straightforward. Positioning wise, you actually want to put her in C1 or in C7, and then you want to actually put the shitters who aren't going to be really doing anything in the 3rd row as well. This is because of the way that her clones work. Basically, the way that her clones work is that after she casts, she'll start dashing in the 4th row instead of the 3rd row. Because if you put your units here, what's happening is that she kind of goes like this instead. And this can actually cause Zeri to become susceptible to things like CC, things like AoE, like damage debuffs, like Veigar, stuff like that. So that's why you'll see people positioning basically like 3rd row. And I put Jin in the back row here just because I do think Jin 2 actually does pump damage. And if you have extra AD items, I think they actually do end up going on Jin 2. Because Jin 2, like I said very early on in the video, fantastic unit and will do his job, but not ever really worth it to go for Jin 3. Sejuani 2 and Mordekaiser 2 are going to be your main tanks, obviously because of how contested the Sejuani unit is. And quite honestly, how contested Mordekaiser is. At the end of the day, Mordekaiser 2 is easier to hit than Sejuani 2, so you want to make sure that you find a Mordekaiser 2, and that's going to stabilize you most of stage 4. I'll say this as well. I think people when they play Zeri are significantly and severely, those are the same words, overvaluing Zeri 2. This comp is pretty stable on Zeri 1, and I think you are overrolling like crazy if you think you need to hit Zeri 2 on 8. Most of the time, Zeri with 3 good items, especially with Holobow, is going to be stable on Zeri 1. You do not see Zeri 2 on level 8. The main thing that really matters the most when it comes to the Zeri line is that your front line looks good. Jax 2, Mordekaiser 2, the Naafiri, and a Sejuani. Like, that is really all you really need to make sure that the comp lasts long enough that you should be chilling. Making sure that you have enough front line so that Zeri can ramp, because at the end of the day, as long as she's able to ramp, that's really what's going to cause the difference between winning and losing a fight. Some important augments to point out I think are great are Radiant Refactor and Void Swarm. I've heard mixed reactions on Radiant Refactor, but I do think Radiant Ginsu's is disgusting on Zeri. Absolutely foul. I think if you have Radiant Ginsu's Holobow IE, or you don't, I might make the argument that you don't even need Holobow. Like, you actually do Radiant Ginsu's with like Gunblade and like Pulse or Hyper Fangs. I think that's stable on 8. You don't need the Sejuani 2. I would say if this is your board on 8, maybe this is a little ridiculous, but like, you know, like this is a very reasonable like whatchamacallit, reasonable exotech triple items, right? But like if this is your level 8, I think that's super stable. Radiant Ginsu's Zeri, super stable. You don't need the Zeri 2. Mordekaiser 2, that's in the front line. Find one Sej, one Zeri, that's it. Do not roll more unless you are uncontested. And even if that's the case, maybe sit for a round or two and just recheck. I think this is so unbelievably stable during stage 4 that you do not need to invest more. If you aren't stable, realistically, it's either a high roll lobby or maybe you are just like losing by like a unit or 2. Like, it's really not that bad. Or maybe you got cheese and you positioned incorrectly. That's your fault, I think. Right? Like, at the end of the day, this feels so good. So that's why I really want to point out Radiant Refactor, because again, I think Radiant Ginsu is disgustingly good on Zeri. Another item I want to point out as well, or rather augment, excuse me, is Void Swarm. This was some tech I was not familiar with, but I was watching the coach stream earlier today, and someone had mentioned that Void Swarm is super good in the slime. The reason being is that Void Swarm just gives you more time to fortify your front line and to help let Zeri ramp. And I think that makes perfect sense. I think it's also a good augment to help you sort of tempo throughout the early game and save HP as you get to level 8. So I can't really say that I find fault with that statement. I think that is a super good idea. And especially, I believe once you get to stage 6 with this augment, that's when it gets really online, because then you get so many voidlings on your board. And that's when you get super, super fucking strong. So again, Void Storm, really, really cool cool augment and cool way to play around it, and especially in exotech, where that extra frontline really seems like it's valuable. So I love that this was pointed out, and I think that is great. But that basically does it for the line, and obviously Veigar on 9. That's it. All right, moving on. 7 Anima. Oh, the downfall. The downfall of 7 Anima. This comp used to be so good, and right now it's probably sitting at a solid C tier. It's only good if you can tempo with it. You'll notice that that's a common trend throughout a lot of these lines. If you get like a Giga Anima start, maybe you get like Anima Spire. Anima Spire, I think it's sort of agreed upon that now it's actually a pretty good good augment. Sorry, Support Spire. It's a very good augment, and you should be clicking it if you do have a good Anima start. And I think that's fair. I think Support Spire is a lot stronger in the early game, and it gets weaker as the game progresses. But it's good because it gives you so many of those early Anima units, so you get those early upgrades fast, and you're able to tempo into the line. I think if you can find little buddies as well, suddenly you're looking at like I want to say an S tier line, but I would say it's like high A tier if you can find little buddies for this Anima line. I think it's a line that is severely uncontested, but again, you need tempo and you need econ, and you need to find that Leona 2 and Zaya 2 fast, and ideally in Aurora, at least one copy on level 8. If you don't find that Aurora, there is a bit of a discussion about like, okay, like let's say you don't have Aurora, let's say you have like instead you have like the Yumi instead, yeah? Do you play Jin or do you play Viego on level 8? I've heard mixed reactions. I don't actually know the correct answer, but I'm not gonna lie, it feels counterintuitive, but I kind of like the Viego better. I actually do. I think the main argument, I think this came up a while back while I was streaming, but the main reason why is because I think the Viego just gives a little more of that front line. The Anima units survive for a little bit longer. And actually right now, part of the reason why Anima is not so good is because the way that the trait is currently designed is that the weapons get weaker as more of your Anima units die. That's a problem. And that's why the board feels a lot weaker. So that's intended, but I think they're changing it in the next patch. So that's why like Viego's so nice, because you don't really need like the marksman damage. You just need to make sure that the units survive long enough that the weapons are going to do more damage. That's sort of the name of the game right now. So actually, I might even make the argument that I think like augments like bulk might be good because you know that interaction exists. But yeah, that's sort of the reason why it just doesn't feel very good and definitely needs a rework. But I will mention this as well. Warmog's fantastic on Leona. If you're stuck on Leona 1, Warmog feels fantastic. Mostly because Anima just gives you so much armor and MR across the whole board. And then Warmog it's just so much HP stacked on top of that armor and MR. So, you know, stats work multiplicatively against each other. You get the idea. But Warmog is turbo BIS in this line. Obviously, other items like Vow, things like your Gargoyles or your Declaws or your Brambles or whatever it may be, fantastic items. I think those are totally fine. But yeah, you get the idea. Very simple, straightforward line. There isn't too much to really talk about here. This is just 7 Anima again. I'm just gonna close that one. Next one, 6. Oh, whew. I think this is the last one we're gonna talk about today. 6 Golden Ox. Holy. All right, hold on a minute. I gotta stretch for this one. Gotta take a sip of water. All right. 6 Golden Ox. The spiciest of the spice. This comp sucks dick. But it can win out lobbies, which is crazy. This comp sucks massive cock, but it can also massively win out lobbies. So how the fuck does that work? The way the comp works is pretty simple. First off, let's talk about this variation. The Zaya, like, Leona variation of Golden Ox. This was sort of the variation that I think was pretty commonly agreed upon across high elo, that like this is sort of like the main line you play in 6 Golden Ox. But I think people have realized this is shit. This is not good, and it's not good for a couple of reasons. First off, the board's turbo expensive. Annie 2, Aphelios 2, Zaya 2, Leona 2. If you're playing vertical exotech, you only need such 1, 2, Zeri 2, maybe, right? Way too expensive of a line. And the problem with Golden Ox is that you need to get to 9. That is when this line really kicks into gear because you have so much money to roll and stack up the golden ox procs, and then using those rolls you can find legendaries like your Zacks, things like your Viegos, things like your Auroras, right? That is what makes the line so good. So that is how people cap out with this board. And actually, this is not how you cap out with the golden ox. The correct way to actually cap out with golden ox looks like this, where instead, yes, there is 6 golden ox on the board, but realistically speaking, you might notice 2 things. First off, there's an affiliates unit that's not doing jack fucking squat. And the second thing to notice is that you have a dummy here with a +1. Also, realistically speaking, you are not playing this line without a +1, and more specifically, a golem +1. I don't think this line is playable outside of trainer golems. I really don't. So quite honestly, this needs to get taken out of the equation. And suddenly when you look at it, holy shit, it's a 4 golden ox board instead, not 6. 6 is cool and it farms you a lot of money, but you have to be in a really high, like high roll spot to be able to play 6, farm cash, and still win fights. It requires a lot to go right. But when you get to that spot and you get to 9 and you get to play all of these crazy ass units, you get a cap out super fucking high. Now obviously I have stuff like Dynamo in here, but you can play whatever. You can play things like the Samira in here for the AMP. You can get strategists in here. I think there's like an AP strat version of this board where you can play things like I think it's like Samira with the Nico and like the Ekko. Works as well. That gives you your 3 street demon and just do like a ton of damage. Like that's totally fine as well. Viego 2, Garen 2 to farm some mods, Zac 2 as your main tank, Annie 2, Aurora 2 to support your board. There is a ton of damage available in this line, but you have to get there. That's the biggest problem. And like that is sort of the big thing with Golden Ox. I think you just, the way you play Golden Ox, it's so weird. It's like you play 2 Golden Ox and you stack it throughout the game. And you are playing 2 Golden Ox because it just happens to fit on your board. Not necessarily because you've been angling it. And then once you get to the point where you are on 4-2, you play some board that makes sense. Usually it's like some AP strat board that is going to be more akin to like the 5 street demon board that we talked about earlier. But you're going to play some variation that looks like that. And then when you get to 9 and you still have that trainer golem that, hey, by the way, I have a golden ox emblem, have you noticed? And you're like, holy shit, it's like stage 6. Maybe I can pivot into it. And then that's when you start to like pivot into the golden ox units, like super late into the game. And then that's when you go, holy shit, now I can play some golden ox, farm some extra cash, farm some extra stuff. And I still have like 50 HP to burn through. And then I can use golden ox to like turbo cap out my board. That's golden ox right now. So yes, the vertical sucks massive cock. Terrible. Don't ever play the 6 vertical ever. But you can definitely play 4 and you can cap out with 4. Super high. But I would not play this without +1. I know some players can. I've yet to see it. I've been looking for good Golden Ox games. I have yet to see it in high elo where a player does really well with it and he played 6 like kind of like the whole time, because it rarely happens. And even if you find it early, it doesn't feel very good, especially if you're stuck with like no HP or like low HP on stage 4. So there you go. But anyways, oh, we did it. We did it. We got through. Thank you for watching. I hope this was helpful. If you liked the video, if it was helpful, like the video, subscribe, and make sure you stick around for more. And until then, I'll see you guys later for some more VOD reviews, some more mid-patch analysis, and some new content. But until then, take care, guys, and happy climbing.